As Ethan Caldwell, a billion-dollar tech CEO, strolls through the park, his life feels as distant as the children laughing around him. Alone in a crowd, he's lost in a world of success and solitude. But then, a little boy runs up to him, revealing a secret. "My mom has a picture of you in her purse." Shocked and intrigued, Ethan's mind races. Who is this boy? Why would his mother keep a photo of him, a stranger? The boy points him to a woman named Clara, and the mystery deepens. Is there a past he doesn't remember? What does this photograph mean for his future? But before diving into the twists of this story, let me know where you're watching this from in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to stay updated with our stories. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the park as Ethan Caldwell walked along the paved path, his steps slow and deliberate. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fresh grass and the distant hum of life. A few joggers passed him, their rhythmic footsteps almost drowned out by the laughter of children playing nearby. It was a typical scene in a busy urban park, but for Ethan, everything felt oddly distant, as though he was watching it all unfold from a place far removed. He had always been a man in constant motion. As CEO of a major tech company, his days were filled with meetings, calls, and endless decisions. There was little room for downtime, and even less for moments of solitude. But today he had found a brief pocket of free time, a rare window where the demands of his career couldn't reach him. Ethan had grown accustomed to this kind of isolation. His company had become his life, its success and its future consuming nearly every waking moment. Relationships had suffered, friendships had faded, and any semblance of personal life had slipped away in the pursuit of his professional ambitions. He often wondered how had he gotten so lost, so distant from everything that once mattered. He glanced around, observing the children chasing each other, their laughter filling the air. The joy they exuded seemed almost foreign to him now. He hadn't felt that kind of carefree happiness in years. With a sigh, he slowed his pace, finding a bench near a large oak tree, and sat down. It was a brief moment of respite, a tiny fragment of peace amidst the noise of his world. A moment of peace. It's been a while, he muttered under his breath, almost as if trying to convince himself that this fleeting moment was enough. But the truth was, it wasn't. The quiet felt empty, a reminder of the sacrifices he had made in the name of success. He wasn't sure what it was he was missing. Perhaps it was connection, or maybe it was something more. All he knew was that it had been a long time since he had allowed himself to just stop and breathe. His thoughts were interrupted by the sounds of children nearby, their voices high-pitched and full of life. He looked up just as a boy no older than 8 ran past him in pursuit of a floating bubble, his face lighting up with sheer delight. The boy's laughter was contagious, and Ethan found himself smiling involuntarily, caught up in the simple joy of the moment. The boy suddenly stopped, his eyes catching Ethan's. He tilted his head as if recognizing something, and then bounded over with a curious energy. "Hey, mister," the boy said, looking up at Ethan with a grin. "My mom has a picture of you in her purse." Ethan rapidly scanned the front of the store. Ethan blinked, surprised by the remark. He had heard plenty of strange things in his life, but this one caught him off guard. His father replied, "Really?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. "She does?" The boy nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, it's kind of old though. You look younger in it, but it's definitely you." Ethan's brow furrowed. "Are you sure it's me?" The boy, still smiling, gave an earnest nod. "Yeah, I saw it. It's really old, but it's you." Ethan's mind raced, trying to place any context for what this could mean. The boy's certainty left him with a strange feeling of unease. What kind of picture was this? Why would a mother still have a photo of him? He had no idea who the boy or his mother were, but something about this encounter felt oddly familiar. The boy, sensing that Ethan was deep in thought, pointed to a nearby bench where a woman was sitting, watching the children. "That's her," Her name's Mom, but other people call her Clara." The boy also pointed to a map the courtyard. Clara. The name echoed in Ethan's mind, though he couldn't place it. He stood up, the mystery of the situation gnawing at him. Something told him he needed to meet this woman, and with the boy's wide-eyed excitement urging him forward, Ethan made his way toward her, unsure of what he would find, but knowing he couldn't ignore the pull of curiosity. In his path, Ethan paused by the oak tree, his thoughts still tangled from the unexpected interaction with the boy. He looked back toward the children, all of them chasing bubbles that shimmered in the soft golden light of the late afternoon. The sight was simple, yet it stirred something deep inside him, a fleeting sense of connection, perhaps, or just the strange longing for a simpler, carefree time. His gaze drifted over the park, but then something caught his attention. The same boy, Charlie, was once again running through the grass, his small legs pumping with excited energy as he chased after another bubble. Ethan couldn't help but smile, the infectious joy radiating from the child, pulling him into the moment. There was something pure and unburdened in the way Charlie moved, so completely immersed in the joy of the game. Charlie noticed Ethan watching him, and without missing a beat broke into a wide grin, racing toward him. His face was flushed with excitement, his eyes sparkling as he stopped right in front of Ethan, still panting from his sprint. "He missed her!" Charlie exclaimed, his voice high-pitched and full of enthusiasm. "My mom has a picture of you in her purse." Ethan blinked, taken aback by the comment. He hadn't expected this. The boy's sudden familiarity with him made the situation even stranger, and a wave of confusion washed over him. How did this child know who he was? "She does," Ethan asked, surprised. His eyes searched the boy's face for any sign of mischief, but there was only earnestness in his gaze. Charlie nodded vigorously, his grin widening. "Yeah, it's kind of old, though. You look younger in it, but it's definitely you." Ethan's curiosity deepened. He hadn't been expecting anything like this, certainly not from a child he had never met. "Are you sure it's me?" he asked, trying to make sense of the situation. His voice was tentative, his mind racing through a list of possibilities. Was this some kind of joke? Or was there something more here that he didn't understand? Charlie's confidence only grew. He stepped closer to Ethan, leaning forward slightly, as if to emphasize his certainty. "Yeah," he said with conviction. "I saw it. It's really old, but it's you." Ethan's mind swirled, still processing the words, but the child's unwavering certainty made his stomach tighten with a strange unease. The mention of a picture, of photograph, piqued his interest. What photo? And more importantly, why would a mother have a picture of him, a picture old enough to be noticed by a child? Death. Before Ethan could ask more, Charlie's attention darted back to the bubbles floating nearby. He pointed toward them excitedly, momentarily distracted from the conversation. Look, it's another one!" Ethan stood still, trying to process everything that had just happened. His eyes wandered back to the bench where the woman, Clara, was sitting, now more intrigued than ever. The child's innocent declaration about a photograph had struck a chord deep within him. Could it really be him in that photo? And why had the boy mentioned it in such a casual manner, as if it were something he had seen 100 times before? Ethan turned to look at the boy again, but Charlie was already running off, chasing after the bubbles once more. The moment of connection, brief as it was, left Ethan with more questions than answers, and a growing sense of anticipation gnawed at him. His feet moved, almost on their own, as he made his way toward Clara, his mind still tangled in the mystery that had just unfolded. Charlie, his attention now fully on the drifting bubbles, laughed joyfully as he chased them across the park. But, almost as if remembering something, he suddenly stopped, turned back to Ethan, and pointed eagerly in the direction of the bench. "That's her!" he exclaimed, eyes bright with excitement. "Her name's Mom, but other people call her Clara." Ethan followed the boy's finger. his gaze landing on the woman sitting quietly on the bench. She was looking down at something in her hands, her posture relaxed, yet there was an unmistakable air of contemplation about her. The late afternoon light highlighted her features, casting a warm glow around her. But it was her familiarity, the feeling that he knew her from somewhere, that tugged at his mind. He studied her for a moment, trying to place her face, but nothing came to him. Still, there was something in the way she sat there, a quiet presence that stirred a memory he couldn't quite grasp. For a brief second, Ethan hesitated. He had no idea who this woman was or why the mention of her name felt like an echo in the back of his mind. But the connection to the photo that Charlie had mentioned, and the strange sense of recognition that stirred within him, pushed the uncertainty aside. Something in his gut told him he needed to understand more. "I think I need to meet your mom," Ethan said, his voice now tinged with seriousness. He turned his attention back to Charlie, who was still caught up in the bubbles, oblivious to Ethan's growing curiosity. Charlie's grin widened as he looked up at Ethan. "Yeah, she'll like you. She's always talking about people from the old days." Ethan felt a brief pang in his chest at those words, though he couldn't understand why. There was something oddly intimate about Charlie's comment, as if the boy knew more about him than he should. But he shook the thought away, focusing instead on the task at hand. He walked toward the bench, his steps deliberate and slow, trying to steady the anticipation building in his chest. As he approached, he noticed that Clara had raised her head and was watching him with a cautious, almost guarded expression. The moment their eyes met, something clicked within Ethan, as if the pieces of a puzzle were slowly starting to fall into place. But still, he couldn't quite make sense of it. He stopped just a few feet away from her, unsure of how to begin. The brief encounter with her son had already sparked a whirlwind of questions, but there she was, a stranger and yet not, standing in front of him. Clara, her lips pressed together in a tight smile, stood up from the bench. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if she were sizing him up. "Hello," Ethan said, his voice steady but a hint of uncertainty lingering beneath the surface. "I'm Ethan. I believe your son has something to tell me about a picture." Clara's expression shifted, her eyes flickering with recognition, or perhaps disbelief, and in that moment, Ethan's heart skipped a beat. It was brief, barely noticeable, but it was there. She looked at him as if she had seen a ghost. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the park seemed to fade into the background as the world around them grew quieter. The air between them hummed with something unspoken, a tension that was thick enough to make Ethan's throat tighten. He didn't know why, but his pulse quickened. Something told him that this encounter, however casual it seemed, was far from ordinary. Clara cleared her throat and took a small step toward him, her face softening, though her eyes remained cautious. "Charlie talks about old things a lot," she said, her voice steady but with an undercurrent of something else, something Ethan couldn't quite read. "But I didn't expect to see you here." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Ethan nodded, unsure of how to respond. His curiosity, however, was too strong to ignore. He needed to understand what this moment was all about, and more importantly, what role Clara had in it. As Ethan drew closer to the bench, Clara stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. There was a moment, almost imperceptible, when their eyes met and everything around them seemed to blur. For a brief second, it felt as though the world had paused, the park's laughter and the distant hum of life fading into the background. It wasn't just her presence, it was the weight of recognition, of something long buried, coming to the surface. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Clara's face was different, marked by time but still familiar in ways that made his heart ache. Her eyes, once filled with the carefree spark of youth, now held a quiet reserve, a layer of caution that hadn't been there before. And yet, beneath that guarded expression, there was something deeply comforting, something that felt like home. "Ethan?" Clara's voice was soft, almost a whisper, as if she couldn't quite believe her own words. He nodded, the weight of the years between them pressing down on him. "Clara, it's been a long time." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the years they had spent apart. Neither of them moved for a moment, as if unsure of how to bridge the distance that had grown between them over the years. Clara forced a smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. The emotion behind it too complex to unravel in a single glance. "I didn't expect to see you here," Clara said, her voice a mix of surprise and something else. Regret, perhaps? Her eyes flickered toward Charlie, who was still playing near the oak tree, unaware of the tension that was building between his mother and the man who had once been a part of her life. Ethan glanced at the boy, still chasing bubbles, and then back at Clara. The unexpectedness of the situation was more than just the coincidence of the meeting. It felt like something deeper, like a chapter of his life he hadn't finished, now unfolding in front of him. "Neither did I," he replied, his voice quieter now, his words carrying more weight than he had intended. Clara's eyes softened as she looked back at Charlie. "I'm sorry, if he bothered you." "He's curious." Her tone was apologetic, as if she felt the need to explain the encounter, to smooth over the awkwardness that hung in the air. But Ethan didn't mind. The last thing he felt was bothered. "No bother," Ethan said gently, offering a small smile. "But he mentioned a picture." His voice trailed off, and for the first time, Clara's expression changed. Her guard coming up, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she had just been asked a question she wasn't ready to answer. "It's nothing," she replied quickly, her tone guarded, her words sharp. "Just an old photo." Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach. There was something about the way she dismissed it, something in the way her voice had faltered. He couldn't let it go, not now. He had come this far, and he needed to understand what was really happening. His gaze didn't waver from Clara's face as he pressed on. "Why would you still have it?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. He had to know. The photograph. The way Charlie had mentioned it, it all pointed to something. He just couldn't figure out what. Clara hesitated, her eyes flickering away from his for a moment, as if searching for the right words to deflect, to avoid whatever question Ethan had just raised. Her fingers brushed nervously against the strap of her purse, her shoulders stiffening. When she finally spoke, her voice was more controlled, though the tension was palpable. "It's just a part of the past," she said, her words measured. "Something I couldn't bring myself to throw away." Ethan felt a flicker of something. Was it recognition, or just the weight of the unspoken things between them? Either way, the moment stretched, each word, each gesture, carrying the invisible weight of everything they had left unsaid over the years. He wasn't ready to let this go. Not now. "I don't understand," Ethan said quietly. "If it was just a photo, why keep it all this time? Why not let go of the past?" Clara's eyes darkened, and for a brief moment, Ethan could see the flicker of old wounds. Her lips pressed together tightly, her gaze now far away. She didn't answer right away, and Ethan began to sense that there was more to this than just a photograph. There was a history, a story buried beneath the surface, and for the first time in years, he wasn't sure he was ready to hear it. The tension that had settled between Ethan and Clara was palpable, thick and heavy in the air. Clara's posture had stiffened again, her gaze shifting uneasily as she avoided Ethan's eyes. The quiet space between them felt like a chasm, filled with unspoken truths and unresolved questions. Ethan's mind raced, but before he could press further, the moment was interrupted by the sound of small footsteps pounding the pavement. Charlie appeared, running back toward them, his face flushed with excitement. At his heels was Max, a scruffy golden retriever happily trotting along, his tail wagging wildly. The dog was just as eager as Charlie, bouncing on his paws as if he too had something to share. Ethan couldn't help but smile at the sight of the boy and his dog. There was something about their unfiltered joy that eased the tension, a reminder of how simple happiness could be. Charlie bounded up to his mother, his eyes wide with excitement. "Mom, Max did the trick, did you see?" His voice was breathless with the energy of a child eager to share his triumph. Clara's expression softened immediately. The guardedness in her eyes began to fade, replaced by a warmth that seemed to flow through her as she looked down at Charlie. She bent down slightly, offering a small smile. "I saw, sweetheart," she said, her voice gentle. "Good job." Charlie beamed, his pride radiating from him as he pulled Max closer, the dog now sitting obediently at his side. "He's the best dog ever," Charlie said, his words tumbling out in his excitement. He patted Max on the head, and the dog happily licked his face, sending Charlie into a fit of giggles. For a moment, the tension between Ethan and Clara seemed to evaporate, replaced by the easy, natural interaction between mother and son. Clara's focus shifted entirely to Charlie, her attention now fully on him and his latest accomplishment. She watched him with a tenderness that was unmistakable, her earlier discomfort momentarily forgotten in the joy of her son's happiness. Ethan observed the exchange, feeling a strange mix of emotions. There was something deeply endearing about Clara's relationship with Charlie, and it made him wonder what their life together had been like. As much as he tried to focus on the present, his mind kept returning to the questions that had been raised, questions that, for now, remained unanswered. But for the moment, he allowed himself to enjoy the scene before him, the simple happiness that radiated from the young boy, the warmth of a mother's pride. He knew this was fleeting, that sooner or later the conversation would turn back to the photo, to the past, to the unspoken truths that still hung in the air. But for now, the world around him felt just a little less heavy. Charlie turned to Ethan, his grin still wide. "Do you want to see Max's trick?" he asked eagerly, clearly hoping to impress Ethan with his dog's skills. Ethan smiled, his heart lightening at the boy's enthusiasm. "Sure, show me what he can do." Charlie's eyes lit up. "Okay, sit," he commanded, and Max obediently sat down, his tail wagging furiously. The trick was simple but impressive. A well-trained dog that could follow Charlie's every command without hesitation. Ethan couldn't help but laugh as Max did a little twirl, earning him a round of applause from Charlie. Clara watched the exchange with a soft smile, the warmth returning to her face as she observed Ethan and Charlie's budding connection. It was a fleeting moment of normalcy, one that didn't involve questions or hidden pasts, just a mother, a son, and a dog. But deep down, Clara knew that the past would soon resurface, and when it did, everything would change. For now, however, she allowed herself to savor the simplicity of the moment. Her son's joy, Ethan's smile, and the quiet peace that seemed to envelop them all. The conversation progressed smoothly, and her daughter told Ethan tales of their travels and their friendship as she buried herself. After the brief exchange in the park, Ethan and Clara agreed to meet in a quieter setting, away from the chaos of the afternoon. Clara suggested a small coffee shop a few blocks away, a place she frequented for the calm it offered. The coffee shop, tucked on a side street, was a haven of soft lighting and quiet chatter, the kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where conversations could unfold without interruption. It was the perfect environment for what was to come, a conversation long overdue. Ethan arrived first, his thoughts already racing. He had no idea what he was walking into, but something about seeing Clara again had opened a floodgate of memories, feelings he hadn't expected to resurface. He hadn't thought about her in years, not in any meaningful way. But now, with the past suddenly present, the weight of their shared history loomed over him. When Clara arrived, she was exactly as he remembered, though time had altered her in subtle ways. Her hair was a little darker, and there were lines on her face that hadn't been there before, signs of the years they had both lived without one another. She walked into the coffee shop with an air of quiet resolve, but when her eyes met Ethan's, there was something else. Something that hinted at the unresolved past between them. Ethan stood as she approached, offering a faint smile. He wasn't sure what to say, but the words seemed to come naturally when he saw the familiar warmth in her eyes. She was still Clara, the woman who had once meant everything to him, and yet so much had changed. He sat down across from him. There was a brief, almost uncomfortable silence. Ethan's hands rested on the table in front of him, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim of his coffee cup. He couldn't help but notice how much more guarded Clara seemed now. The years apart had built walls between them, walls that neither of them seemed eager to break down. Clara broke the silence first, her voice casual, but there was a note of hesitation beneath the surface. "It's been, 15 years?" she asked, glancing up at Ethan. She had a dark smile and a pretty lofty bulge. Ethan's gaze softened, his mind racing through the years since they had last spoken. "Closer to 20, he replied, his voice low. The years felt like a blur, a lifetime ago, and yet it all seemed to rush back in an instant. The memories of their time together, their dreams, their plans. They all flooded back in waves, each one sharper than the last. Clara nodded slowly, her fingers tapping against her coffee cup. "It's been a long time," she said, her voice soft, as if she were measuring each word before it left her lips. Ethan nodded, but there was more on his mind than just time. He had spent years buried in his career, building a life that, on the surface, appeared perfect. But now, sitting here with Clara, he realized how much he had lost in the process, how much he had neglected. "I never thought I'd see you again," he said gently, his voice carrying the weight of years gone by. Clara's expression softened, a flicker of something passing through her eyes before she glanced toward the door, where Charlie was still waiting outside, his playful energy a stark contrast to the heaviness between them. She paused for a moment before responding, her tone thoughtful. "Life is funny that way." Ethan's gaze followed hers, his thoughts lingering on the boy, on the connection that was now impossible to ignore. He didn't know where to begin, didn't know how to untangle the knot of emotions and questions that had been stirred up in him. But Clara was here, in front of him, and for better or worse, this moment was the beginning of something he hadn't been prepared for. The silence between them stretched for a moment, but it was different now. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was expectant, like the calm before a storm. Ethan knew that whatever came next would change everything. The quiet clink of coffee cups and the hum of soft conversation filled the air around them, but the silence between Ethan and Clara felt heavy. As they sat in the small, intimate coffee shop, the unspoken words between them seemed to hang like a fog. Every so often, Ethan would glance at Clara, watching her carefully as she avoided meeting his gaze. He could feel the unease building in her, the subtle tension that told him she was holding something back. And then there was Charlie's mention of the photograph, the one that had brought them together in such an unexpected way. It was a thread Ethan couldn't ignore. After a few moments of sipping his coffee, Ethan broke the silence, his voice gentle but insistent. "Charlie mentioned a photo. Of me. Why still carry it around?" He leaned forward slightly, his eyes searching Clara's face, trying to catch a glimpse of what lay behind her guarded expression. Clara flinched, the question clearly catching her off guard. Her fingers fidgeted with the handle of her cup, her gaze flicking to the side before she looked down at the table, as if she were trying to collect her thoughts. For a long moment she didn't speak, and Ethan could feel the tension radiating from her. He could see that she was struggling with something deep inside her that she didn't want to share. "It's nothing," Clara finally said, her voice softer now, but her words still carrying a weight of finality. just a piece of my past." Ethan didn't move, his eyes never leaving hers. He could tell she was holding back, but he needed more. The mention of the photo had been too specific, too loaded for him to let it go. He had to know why it was still so important to her. Why was it something she kept, something Charlie recognized? And more importantly, what did it mean for them, both for the past they had shared and for the present that was unfolding before them? "I'd still like to see it if you don't mind," he said softly, his voice coaxing but respectful. He could see Clara's hesitation, the way she had tensed at the mention of the photo, but the curiosity gnawed at him. There was something about that old picture that felt important, something that might unlock answers to questions he hadn't even known he was asking. Clara sighed, the sound a mixture of resignation and something deeper, perhaps regret or nostalgia. She reached down into her purse, her fingers brushing against the leather strap as she rummaged through it, taking a moment longer than Ethan had expected. Her eyes were downcast as she pulled out a small, faded photograph, the edges slightly frayed from years of being carried around. She placed it gently on the table, avoiding Ethan's gaze as she did so. "Okay," Clara said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes met his for a fleeting second before she quickly looked away, almost as if she couldn't bear to see his reaction. Ethan didn't reach for the photo immediately. He wanted to give her the space, the time to process, but he could feel his pulse quickening as the moment drew near. This was it, the first real glimpse into the past they had both been avoiding. Slowly he picked up the photograph, his fingers brushing the edges of the picture as if it were fragile, precious. He could see the faded image of a much younger Clara and himself, standing close together, smiling in front of a backdrop of what looked like a beach. It was a memory from a time that felt so distant, a life he hadn't thought about in years. As his gaze lingered on the photograph, a rush of memories flooded back, moments of shared laughter, dreams of the future that had felt so real then, so tangible. He remembered the warmth of her hand in his, the way they had once talked about everything and nothing at the same time. But all of that seemed so far away now. The picture, frozen in time, was a stark reminder of how much had changed. Ethan swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "I remember this day," he said, his eyes tracing the lines of the photo. "It was just before I left for college." Clara's voice was soft as she nodded, her eyes distant. "You insisted on bringing that old camera of yours. You said we'd want photos." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat, the weight of the years pressing down on him. He had never imagined that something as simple as an old photograph could stir up so much emotion, so many memories of what they had lost. "I didn't think you'd still have it," he said, quietly, the words full of disbelief and sorrow. Clara sighed, her eyes closing briefly as if the memories were too much to bear. "I didn't for a long time," she admitted. "But I found it years later. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away." Her voice faltered, the weight of the truth in her words heavy between them. Ethan stared at the photograph, the questions he had been holding back threatening to spill out. But for a moment, he just sat there, lost in the past, trying to reconcile the image of the woman he had once known with the woman sitting across from him now. As Clara placed the photograph on the table, Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The image was simple enough. Two young people, standing close together, their faces lit up with smiles that spoke of carefree moments and a future full of possibilities. The edges of the photograph were worn, a testament to the years it had spent tucked away in Clara's purse. But the faces within the frame were as vivid as the day they had been captured. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he looked down at the photo. It was a moment frozen in time, a memory from a chapter of his life he hadn't thought about in far too long. There he was, younger, perhaps more naive, standing beside Clara. She was smiling at him, her eyes bright with a hopefulness he now realized he hadn't noticed at the time. The world around them seemed full of promise, a stark contrast to the weight of everything that had happened since then. He stared at the photo, unable to look away, as memories of that day flooded back to him, warm, golden moments that seemed to belong to a different life, one before the years of separation, before everything had unraveled. He could almost hear the sound of the waves crashing in the background, the scent of salt water in the air, and the sound of Clara's laugh, so clear in his mind it felt as though it were happening right there in the coffee shop. "I remember this day," Ethan said softly, his voice almost a whisper as he traced the edges of the photo with his finger. "It was just before I left for college." Clara nodded slowly, her gaze flickering briefly to the photograph before returning to Ethan. The emotion in her eyes was subtle, but it was there, hidden just beneath the surface, just as it had always been between them. "You insisted on bringing that old camera of yours," she said, her voice carrying a trace of fondness. "You said we'd want photos." The words struck Ethan harder than he had anticipated. It wasn't just about the photo, he realized. It was about the things they had shared, those moments that now seemed so distant, so irretrievable. The carefree days, the certainty they had once shared about their future. Back then, everything felt permanent. Nothing felt like it could slip away. His fingers lingered on the photo for a moment longer, his mind drifting to the years that had come after. "I didn't think you'd still have it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The thought of Clara holding on to that photograph, keeping it all these years, it was almost too much for him to grasp. Clara sighed, her eyes darkening as she looked down at the table. "I didn't, for a long time," she said quietly, the weight of her words hanging in the air between them. "But I found it years later. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away." The simplicity of her admission, the quiet way she revealed the truth, made Ethan's chest tighten. The photograph had been a bridge between their past and the present, and now, seeing it again, it felt like they were standing on that same bridge, caught between two worlds. Clara's words weren't just about the photo. They were about everything that had happened between them. The distance, the silence, the lost years. It was a piece of their shared history that neither of them had been able to completely let go of, no matter how much time had passed. As he held the photo in his hands, Ethan felt a rush of emotions. Nostalgia, regret, and something more raw, something that stirred deep within him. He had never imagined that something so small, something so simple as a photograph, could bring so much to the surface. And yet, here it was, this single image, that had somehow carried all the weight of their past, and now it was here, in front of him, in the middle of a coffee shop, pulling him back to a time he thought he had left behind. He swallowed hard, trying to push past the lump in his throat. "I never thought I'd be here again," he said quietly, almost as an afterthought, the words slipping out before he could stop them. And in that moment, Ethan realized just how true they were. He never thought he'd be sitting across from Clara again, never thought they would be facing the remnants of their past in this way. The future, it seemed, had a way of surprising you when you least expected it. The photograph lay between them, its edges frayed from years of being carried, yet the emotions it stirred felt fresh and raw. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to process everything. The memories it evoked, the way it connected him to a past he had long since closed off, and the sudden realization that something much deeper was at play. Clara's reluctance, her hesitations, and the way she had kept the photo for so many years, they all pointed toward one undeniable truth. Charlie, the boy in the park, the one who had recognized him, who had spoken of the picture. Ethan's heart began to race as everything clicked into place. His thoughts spun back to the moment when Charlie had first mentioned the photograph, the certainty in the boy's voice, the way he had referred to Clara as Mom, the casualness with which he spoke of the photo. It all made sense now. The realization hit him like a wave, and he couldn't push it away any longer. Ethan placed the photograph back on the table gently, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of his next words hanging heavy on his tongue. He had to ask, had to know. The questions that had been swirling in his mind now came crashing to the surface. "Will not tell me sooner, Clara?" His voice was gentle but edged with pain. "Why keep it from me?" Clara flinched at the question, her hands tightening around her coffee cup as if she were trying to hold on to something that might slip away. She avoided his gaze, her eyes turning to the side as she struggled to find the right words. The silence between them felt suffocating, and Ethan could almost see the walls she had built over the years, walls that she was reluctant to let come down. "It's complicated," Clara said quietly, her voice soft but filled with a tension that Ethan could feel in his bones. "I didn't want to ruin your life." Her words hung in the air, but they didn't make sense to him. How could she have kept something like this from him? How could she have let him go for so long without telling him the truth? His chest tightened, and he couldn't hold back the pain that laced his voice. "I have to face a reality that seems high, and yet contains a price I will resist to end." "You didn't give me a choice," Ethan replied softly, his words more a reflection of the hurt he was feeling than anger. The truth had been kept from him for years, and now, sitting across from Clara, he couldn't help but feel the weight of all the lost time. Clara's eyes flickered with emotion, but she still didn't meet his gaze. The air between them seemed thick with unsaid words, and as the seconds stretched, Ethan could feel her internal battle playing out in real time. Finally, Clara spoke, but the words were raw, layered with a vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to show. "I thought you were better off without it," she said, her voice trembling as she looked down at the table. Her hands were shaking now, betraying the calm facade she had tried to maintain. "I didn't want to burden you with something you didn't need to know. I didn't want you to have to carry that responsibility." The truth was slipping out, bit by bit, and with each word Clara spoke, the pieces of Ethan's own past began to shift, aligning in a way that felt inevitable. He stared at her, the weight of everything now sinking in. "I wasn't given the chance to decide that," he said, his voice firm but laden with emotion. The realization was stark, almost too much to bear. He had never been allowed to make that choice, never been given the opportunity to step into a role he hadn't even known existed. Clara paused at his words, her eyes now glistening with tears. She blinked quickly, as if trying to stop the emotions from spilling over. But it was clear that the weight of her decision, of the years she had spent protecting Ethan from the truth, was finally taking its toll on her. Ethan's mind raced, the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm him, but his focus remained on Clara. The silence between them stretched once more, but this time it was different. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence filled with the realization that the truth was finally out, that the distance between them was about to close. He took a deep breath, his voice softer now, but the hurt still evident. "So, Charlie is mine." The question was simple, but it carried the weight of everything that had come before and everything that was still left to be understood. Ethan sat alone in his office, the phone pressed to his ear as he waited for the information he had requested. The walls of his office, lined with awards and certificates, seemed to close in around him. There had been too many questions, too many doubts lingering in his mind since the day he had seen Clara again. But now, sitting in the cold silence of his office, he was ready for the truth. No more guessing, no more speculation. He had hired a private investigator, Daniel Carter, a man with a reputation for getting to the heart of things. It wasn't something Ethan was proud of, but he needed answers. It was the only way he could make sense of the overwhelming emotions and the whirlwind of information that had been dropped in his lap. When Daniel's voice crackled through the line, Ethan sat up straight, the anticipation thick in his chest. "Mr. Caldwell," Daniel began, his voice calm and professional. "I've completed my investigation into Clara Evans and her son, Charlie." Ethan's pulse quickened, and Daniel paused for a moment, as if collecting his thoughts before continuing. "Clara Evans is a single mother. Charlie's father is not listed on his birth certificate." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything he had suspected, everything he had feared. "So, it's true," Ethan murmured, the shock of the revelation settling over him like a heavy blanket. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Ethan could hear the quiet shuffle of paper as Daniel continued with the details. "It appears Clara has kept Charlie's paternity a secret all these years. According to her records, she never listed anyone as the father, and there's no legal claim on Charlie's birth certificate." Ethan's mind raced as the weight of the information sank in. The photo, the strange sense of familiarity, Charlie's mention of the picture. It had all pointed to this moment. But hearing it confirmed, hearing it spoken aloud, made everything feel so much more real. Stood and said. Ethan's grip tightened on the phone. He thought of Clara, of the years they had spent apart, of the choices she had made. The silence between them had carried so many unspoken truths, and now he could see them all laid out in front of him. But what was the truth behind her decision to keep Charlie from him all these years? What had she been trying to protect him from? "I need more," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the turmoil he felt inside. "Was there a reason why she kept this from me? Any reason she chose not to tell me about Charlie?" Daniel hesitated again, a sign that the investigation had yielded some information that wasn't easy to share. "I'm still working on getting more details," he said finally. "But from what I've gathered, it seems Clara was trying to protect both you and Charlie. She feared that telling you the truth would complicate things, perhaps force you to take responsibility for a life you weren't prepared for at the time." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. Protect him? From the responsibility of being a father? The anger and frustration that had been building inside him now had a clear target. She had kept Charlie from him, kept him from the truth, because she thought he wouldn't be able to handle it. She hadn't given him a choice. Ethan's voice was tight with emotion when he spoke again. "I had a right to know," he said softly, more to himself than to Daniel. The years of missed moments, the lost opportunity to be a part of his son's life. It all felt like it had been taken from him. Daniel cleared his throat. "I understand, Mr. Caldwell. I'll continue to gather information, but that's what I've uncovered so far." Ethan sat back in his chair, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. The pieces of his past and present were slowly falling into place, but the road ahead was unclear. He had been kept in the dark for so long, and now that the truth had finally come to light, he had to decide what came next. How could he move forward? How could he make up for all the lost time? Ethan stood outside Clara's apartment, his hand poised to knock, but his mind was elsewhere. The days since his conversation with Daniel had felt like a whirlwind. Truths unearthed, emotions unburied, and a lifetime of unanswered questions pressing in on him. He had thought he could process everything in his own time. But now, as he stood on her doorstep, the weight of it all felt unbearable. The answers he had sought had led him to this moment, and he was ready to confront Clara, to demand the truth. With a deep breath, he knocked. It took only a moment before Clara's familiar figure appeared in the doorway, her face drawn and tired, though her expression softened when she saw him. There was a brief flicker of hesitation in her eyes, but she stepped aside to let him in without a word. The silence between them was suffocating as Ethan entered the apartment, the familiar surroundings making the situation even more surreal. Clara closed the door behind him, and they stood facing each other in the living room, the tension between them palpable. "I talked to Lila," Ethan said firmly, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of what he had learned. She told me everything." Clara's face went pale at the mention of La's name. Her eyes widened in shock, and she took an instinctive step back. For a moment, she said nothing, her lips trembling as if she were struggling to find the words. The truth, which she had kept hidden for so long, was now out in the open. Ethan could see it in her face, the guilt, the fear, the way the truth had hit her harder than she had expected. "I didn't want to burden you," Clara finally whispered, her voice breaking. She shook her head, her eyes welling with tears as she looked away from Ethan. "I never meant for you to find out this way. I thought it was better for you not to know." Ethan's anger flared, his frustration boiling over. He had spent too many years in the dark, too many years not knowing about Charlie, about his own son. The realization that Clara had made that decision for him, that she had taken that choice out of his hands, was too much to bear. "You didn't give me the right to decide for myself," he said angrily, his voice thick with emotion. He couldn't hold back any longer. The years of confusion, the missed opportunities, the lost time with his son, it all came rushing to the surface. He had been denied a choice, denied the chance to be a father when he should have been. Clara's eyes filled with tears, and she let out a shaky breath as she stepped closer to him, her face contorting with regret. "I thought I was protecting you," she said, her voice barely audible. "I didn't want to hurt you. I thought it would be better if you didn't know. Better for you. Better for Charlie." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. She had believed she was protecting him. By keeping him from the truth, she had robbed him of everything that could have been, of the years he could have spent with his son, of the moments they could have shared. The anger in him mixed with a deep sadness, and he felt his throat tighten. "You robbed me of 8 years with my son," he said softly, his voice breaking as the gravity of it all settled in. The lost time, the missed moments, the connections that could have been made. It all came rushing in on him, threatening to swallow him whole. Charlie wasn't just a stranger anymore. He was his flesh and blood, and yet those years had been stolen from him. Clara's sobs came quietly at first, her face crumpling as the weight of her own decisions became too much to bear. She reached out toward him, but Ethan didn't move. The distance between them was more than physical now. It was emotional, and it felt insurmountable. He didn't know if they could ever bridge that gap, not after everything that had happened. The air was thick with regret and unspoken words. They were both trapped in the past, in choices made and lost time. But as the seconds ticked by, Ethan realized that nothing could change what had happened. The past couldn't be undone. The only thing left to do now was figure out what came next. The silence in Clara's apartment was thick, heavy with the weight of their past, their mistakes, and the unspoken truths that had lingered between them for so long. Ethan stood across from Clara, his chest tight, his emotions raw and exposed. The anger, the hurt, the years of confusion, they all seemed to swirl within him, mixing with the hope that perhaps, after everything, there was still a chance for something better. For Charlie, for him, for Clara too. Clara's tears had subsided, though her face was still blotchy, her eyes red from the torrent of emotions she had been carrying for so long. She stood there, unsure of what to say next, her body language still defensive, as if she were preparing for another blow. But Ethan wasn't here to fight with her anymore. He wasn't here to place blame or wallow in the past. He had one goal now, to be a part of Charlie's life, no matter what. "I want to be part of Charlie's life," Ethan said, his voice steady but full of emotion. There was a vulnerability in his words, but it was genuine, sincere. He was standing in front of Clara, the woman who had once been the center of his world, but now it wasn't about them. It was about Charlie, the son he had never known but whose presence had somehow filled the empty spaces in his life in a way he hadn't anticipated. He deserves to know the truth. He deserves to know who I am. Clara sighed deeply, her face still a mixture of disbelief and conflict. She looked away for a moment, as though trying to find a way to reconcile the past with the reality of what Ethan was asking. The weight of the decision she had made so many years ago seemed to bear down on her, and Ethan could see the emotional toll it had taken on her. "It's not that simple," she said, her voice shaking with hesitation. There was a catch in her words, a reluctance that Ethan understood all too well. She had spent so many years protecting Charlie, sheltering him from the truth, and now she was being asked to tear down the walls she had built, walls that had kept her son safe from the uncertainty of a father who had never known him. Ethan took a step closer, his voice softening but firm. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his eyes locking with Clara's. "I'm here for you and Charlie. I'm not going to just walk away from this. From him. Not again." The words felt like a promise, a commitment he had never been able to make until now. A promise that he was ready to keep, no matter what it took. Clara's eyes flickered with emotion, her shoulders slumping slightly as she seemed to wrestle with what he had just said. She wasn't ready to let go of the past, wasn't sure how to navigate the new reality Ethan was presenting. But Ethan wasn't asking for her permission to be a father. He was telling her that he was going to do it, whether she was ready for it or not. He had waited long enough. "I never wanted to drag you into this," Clara whispered, her voice breaking again. "I didn't want to hurt you, Ethan. I thought you'd be better off without it all." Ethan shook his head, the weight of her words hitting him harder than he had expected. He could see the conflict in her, the love for Charlie that had driven every decision she had made. But the truth had always been there, waiting, and now it was time to face it. "I'm not going to be part of Charlie's life from the outside anymore," Ethan said softly but with conviction. Clara let out a shaky breath, her face softening as she looked at Ethan. There was something in her eyes now, a mix of uncertainty and acceptance, as if she had finally heard the truth, as if she were finally ready to let go of the control she had held for so long. She was letting him in, piece by piece, despite the fear that still lingered. Ethan could see the shift in her, the small but significant change in how she was looking at him now. Maybe it wasn't all figured out yet. Maybe there was still a long road ahead, full of challenges and tough conversations. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to turn away again. "I'm not asking for everything, Clara," Ethan said, his voice quiet. "I just want a chance to be a father, to be a part of his life, whatever that looks like. I'm ready. I wish James had come to me." Clara stared at him for a moment, and then, as if a weight had finally been lifted from her, she nodded. "Okay," she whispered, the simple word carrying a promise in itself, an agreement, tentative but real. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was a beginning. And for Ethan, that was enough. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the trees, casting a warm golden glow over the park. Ethan, Clara, and Charlie stood at the edge of the playground, watching as children ran by, their laughter carrying on the breeze. The scene was familiar, yet different somehow. For the first time, Ethan felt like he was truly present, a part of the world around him, instead of watching it from the sidelines. Charlie, full of energy and enthusiasm, was already darting around, his attention flicking between the other kids and his dog Max, who was happily bounding in circles around the park. Every so often, Charlie would look back at Ethan, his face lighting up with excitement. Ethan couldn't help but smile at the sight. The pure joy radiating from Charlie was contagious. "Ethan, you coming to play with Max?" Charlie called out, his voice high and cheerful, filled with the kind of excitement that only a child could muster. He was holding Max's leash, but the dog was clearly more interested in running than being led. Charlie's eagerness was palpable, and it was clear he was thrilled by the idea of Ethan joining in. Ethan glanced at Clara, who was standing a few steps away, watching them with a mixture of emotions. There was a subtle tension in her posture, a hesitation that hadn't quite gone away, but she had agreed to this, agreed to give them this chance to spend time together. He knew it wasn't easy for her. It wasn't easy for any of them. But something in the air felt different today, lighter, as though this moment, this new dynamic, might be the beginning of something real, something that could last. Ethan smiled at Charlie's invitation, his eyes glancing back at Clara. "I'd love to," he said, his voice warm. "If it's okay with your mom." Clara hesitated, her eyes flickering between Ethan and Charlie, the decision weighing heavily on her. She had been watching the two of them closely, her gaze softening as she observed Charlie's excitement and Ethan's genuine desire to connect. The uncertainty still lingered in Clara, but she knew that this was part of the process. They were learning to navigate this new chapter together. Finally, Clara let out a small sigh, a reluctant but resigned smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "It's fine," she said, her voice quieter than usual, as though she were still adjusting to the reality of the situation. It wasn't a resounding agreement, but it was progress, a small but significant step forward. Charlie, who had been watching their exchange intently, practically bounced in place, unable to contain his excitement any longer. "Yay! Come on!" he cheered, tugging Max's leash as the dog eagerly followed him. He took off toward the open space, his energy infectious. Ethan chuckled, his heart swelling with a mixture of emotions, happiness, a touch of nervousness, and something deeper, more profound. He looked at Clara for a moment, silently acknowledging the tentative understanding that was slowly forming between them. They were starting to find their rhythm, even if it wasn't perfect yet. As Ethan jogged after Charlie and Max, the sound of their laughter filling the air, he felt a connection begin to form, fragile but real. The park, once just a backdrop to his solitary walks, was now a place where new memories were being made. As he reached Charlie, who was already trying to teach Max a new trick, he realized how much he had missed, how much there was to gain. For the first time in years, Ethan felt like he was exactly where he needed to be, with Charlie, with Clara. The future was uncertain, but in this moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was the bond they were beginning to forge. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, and that was enough for now. As Charlie squealed with joy when Max performed his trick, Ethan couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning. There was still so much to learn, so much to build, but they were doing it together, and for the first time, that felt like enough. Weeks passed, and the tentative steps Ethan, Clara, and Charlie had taken toward understanding one another began to solidify into something more concrete. The awkward silences that had once defined their interactions were slowly being replaced by moments of shared laughter, quiet conversations, and the simple joy of being together. Ethan had become more involved in Charlie's life, attending his soccer games, helping with homework, and even spending weekends at the park playing with Max. It was everything he had longed for, but it was also overwhelming, given the years he had lost. One afternoon, as the three of them were in the living room, playing a board game together, Clara sat on the couch, her eyes following Ethan as he laughed at something Charlie had said. There was a softness in her gaze, a subtle change that Ethan couldn't quite pinpoint, but he noticed it nonetheless. She seemed to be watching them more intently than she had before, as though something had shifted inside her as well. "He's happier since you've been around," Clara said, her voice quiet but full of truth. Her eyes were fixed on Charlie, who was in the middle of setting up the next round of the game, oblivious to the conversation taking place between his mother and Ethan. Ethan glanced at Clara, feeling a twinge of guilt at the words. He could see the change in Charlie too, the way he seemed to have more energy, more confidence. The boy who had once been a bit reserved now laughed more freely, his excitement evident in the way he interacted with Ethan. It was as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders, a weight Ethan had never even known was there. "He's a great kid," Ethan said sincerely, his gaze shifting to Charlie, who was now bouncing in his seat, eager to continue. "I just wish I had known sooner." Clara's face tightened as she looked down at her hands, the weight of regret still present in her posture. I thought I was protecting you," she admitted, her voice quiet, almost fragile. I made the wrong choice. Thank you for preventing me." Ethan could see the hurt in her eyes, the burden of years spent carrying a secret she had never wanted to keep from him. There was so much more she had carried on her own, so many decisions made with the intention of shielding him, but they had come at a cost. He understood her intentions, even if they had been misguided. The complexity of the choices she had made was not lost on him, but it didn't make the years apart any easier to bear. He walked over to where she sat, his hand resting gently on the back of the couch. "What matters is that we're here now," Ethan said softly, his voice steady. "We can't change what happened, but we can make the most of what we have. And we have a lot to work with." Clara looked up at him then, her expression softening. The lines of guilt on her face were still there, but there was something else now, something that had been missing before. A glimmer of hope, of possibility, of understanding. She didn't say anything in response, but the silence that passed between them spoke volumes. And as Ethan watched Clara, he realized that this was the beginning of a new chapter, one that they would all have to navigate together. There would be challenges ahead, he knew that. But there was also the undeniable truth that they were slowly learning how to be a family, despite the mistakes of the past. The journey wouldn't be easy, but it was a journey worth taking. Charlie's laughter rang out again, pulling them both back into the present. As they turned their attention back to him, Ethan couldn't help but smile. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And that was enough. The park had become a place of significance for Ethan, Clara, and Charlie, a symbol of their new beginning. It was where they had first reconnected, where the pieces of their fractured past had slowly started to come together. And now, as they walked along the same paths they had taken so many weeks ago, there was a quiet peace that seemed to settle over them. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a soft orange glow across the grass. The park was quieter than usual, with only a few families scattered about, enjoying the last hours of the day. Charlie was running ahead of them, chasing after Max, who was once again bounding through the grass, his tail wagging furiously. Clara and Ethan walked side by side, their footsteps in sync, a comfortable silence hanging between them. For a moment, everything felt right. The chaos and confusion that had once defined their relationship were fading, replaced by something more grounded, more steady. They were no longer just strangers navigating the remnants of a broken past. They were a family, learning to move forward together. Ethan glanced at Clara, his gaze softening as he took in the sight of her. There was a calmness about her now, a quiet acceptance in the way she moved beside him. It was as if the weight of the decisions she had made, the guilt that had burdened her for so long, had started to lift. There was still a distance between them, a space that needed to be bridged, but it was no longer an insurmountable gap. "Do you ever think about what might have been?" Ethan asked, his voice quiet, breaking the silence. He wasn't sure what he was asking. Perhaps he was simply searching for some acknowledgement of the time they had lost, the moments that would never come back, the years of missed chances, the life that could have been. Clara looked down, her eyes softening as she thought about his question. She hesitated for a moment, then glanced back at Ethan, her voice tinged with a quiet sadness. "Sometimes," she said softly, "but I try not to dwell on it." Her words carried a weight, a truth that resonated deeply with Ethan. He understood. They couldn't change the past, couldn't rewrite the years they had lost, and as much as they might wonder what could have been, they had to focus on what was now, the chance to rebuild, to create something new. Ethan smiled, a small, knowing smile. He had come to terms with the past in his own way, accepting that it was out of his control. "Me too," he replied, his voice steady, but his heart lightening as he said the words. He wasn't going to let regret shape their future. Not anymore. Clara returned his smile, her eyes softening with a tenderness that Ethan hadn't seen in her for years. It was the first time in a long while that they had stood together without the weight of the past hovering between them, without the looming questions of what could have been. They stood there for a moment, watching Charlie and Max play together, their laughter filling the air, carefree and free of the shadows that had once darkened their lives. It was in this simple moment, this quiet, shared peace, that Ethan realized how much they had already begun to heal, how much they had already started to rebuild. As the sun set behind them, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Ethan felt a sense of hope for the first time in years. The future was still uncertain, and there would be challenges ahead, but for now, it was enough. They were together, and that was all that mattered. Charlie ran back toward them, his face alight with excitement. "Mom, Dad, you're coming to play?" he asked, his voice full of joy. Ethan and Clara exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. Without a word, they both nodded, ready to embrace the new chapter that had already begun. Together. As a family. The mummy slowly came to sit down with the masters, and all too quickly felt someone step on their toe. As the months passed, Ethan found himself learning a new rhythm, one that balanced the demands of his career with the joys of his personal life. The shift hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. For years, he had been consumed by his work, chasing success at the expense of everything else. But now, standing beside Clara and Charlie, he realized that the success he had been so focused on didn't hold the same weight anymore. What mattered was the family they were slowly building together. Ethan had carved out time for Charlie, taking him to school, helping him with his science projects, and spending weekends in the park. The bond between them had grown stronger, not out of obligation, but out of genuine love and connection. It wasn't always perfect, but they were learning together how to be a family, how to navigate the complexities of co-parenting, how to create new memories after so many years of absence. All because they had felt a level of safety with each other that specifically resembled the connection they had once felt in the past. Clara, too, had adjusted. The tension that had once marked her every interaction with Ethan had softened. They still had their moments of uncertainty, but those were fewer now. She had let go of the past, not in a grand gesture, but in small, everyday ways, trusting Ethan again, sharing responsibilities with him, and, perhaps most important, letting herself believe in the possibility of their future together. One evening after Charlie had gone to bed, Ethan and Clara sat together on the couch. The apartment was quiet, the sounds of the city outside muted in the stillness. It was a rare moment of calm, and they were both fully present in it, no longer weighed down by the questions that had once defined their relationship. Ethan turned to Clara, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. "I want to be there for him," he said softly, his gaze meeting hers. "And for you." Clara looked at him for a long moment, as though weighing his words, feeling their truth. Her expression softened, and there was something in her eyes that Ethan hadn't seen in a long time. A quiet hope, a tenderness. She wasn't just looking at him as a co-parent anymore, but as something more. "I want that too," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but the conviction behind it was clear. She didn't need to say more. There was understanding in her tone, acceptance in the way she met his gaze. It was the beginning of something neither of them had dared to hope for before. A future where they were more than the past's mistakes, more than the years they had lost. In that moment, Ethan realized how far they had come, how much they had healed. They were no longer two people bound by regret and missed chances, but partners, learning how to build a family from the ground up. They weren't perfect, and there were still moments of doubt, of hesitation, but they had learned to lean on each other. They had learned to trust. As the night stretched on, with the quiet of the apartment enveloping them, Ethan felt a peace he hadn't known in years. He had once thought he couldn't change, that the past was too big a burden to overcome. But now, with Clara beside him and Charlie's laughter echoing in his mind, he realized that change was possible. Slow, steady, and sometimes painful, but ultimately worth it. They weren't just surviving, they were living. Together, for the first time in a long while, Ethan didn't feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs to shape, and for the first time, he was ready to embrace whatever came next. Because after all, the past didn't define them anymore. What mattered was the family they were becoming, and that, Ethan knew, was enough.